This is John Drabinski, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a Mellon Grant-sponsored series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, late doctoral students, and everyone in between, culture workers and political organizers, in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Today's conversation is with Charisse Burden-Stelly, who teaches in the Department of African American Studies at Wayne State University in Detroit, Michigan. In addition to a number of scholarly essays, popular writings, and hosted podcast series, she is the author of two books, W.E.B. Du Bois, A Life in American History from 2019, co-written with Gerald Horne, and Black Scare, Red Scare, Theorizing Capitalist Racism in the United States from 2023, and is the co-editor of two volumes, with Percy, Hintzen and Aaron Kamugisha, Reproducing Domination on the Caribbean Postcolonial State, and with Jodi Dean, co-editor of Organize, Fight, Win, Black Communist Women's Political Writings, published in 2022. In this conversation, we explore the complex political meaning of Black studies as a site of resistance and also an institutionalized field of study, the relation of politics to intellectual inquiry, and the meaning of multiple disciplinary interventions that comprise the field's past, present, and future. Charisse, hello. It's good to see you. How are you doing?
Doing great. Thank you so much for having me on.
Well, I'm really excited that we found this time to talk. You know, you and I have worked together, known each other for a while, and I know your commitment to the field of Black studies is serious, and it has real content to it. So I was especially happy when you said, you had some time to talk about the field today for this podcast. Also love your work, really pushing so many important boundaries in the field. So thank you for that, by the way. I love I say your new book, but I also know you're finishing a book. So like your book that's recently out. I love your work. I love your thoughts on the field, and just really looking forward to this today.
Yeah, thank you so much.
So let me start with a question that's not immediately about the field of Black studies, but just to ask you to talk a little bit about your intellectual journey and thinking about, what is it that drew you to the study of Black life and drew you to the field of Black studies, however you want to think about that, whether it's a sort of long story or particular moments, but also sort of asking, what sustains your commitment to the field across these years?
Yeah. Well, the last question I think is a bit easier. So I'm classically trained in Black studies, meaning my BA, MA, and PhD are in the field. So I don't have any other field to really have an allegiance to. It's what I'm trained in. But I would
that's
say,
a really unique thing, by the way. I love that.
Right. And so undergrad, I did a double major in political science and African American studies at the Barrett Honor College at Arizona State University. But I think I always was interested in sort of why Black people are in the sort of material conditions that we're in, not only in the United States, but across the African diaspora. I was interested in who are the important historical thinkers and political actors who have struggled against these conditions, and who have, allowed us to sustain ourselves over time, particularly 20th century actors. What are the radical dimensions of that struggle? So that is to say, those who are struggling against capitalism, imperialism, colonialism, etc. And so those are questions that I think keep me interested, and those are the questions that animate my work. So I guess perhaps three broad fields. I actually started really looking a lot at development economics and kind of the theory around developmentalism, especially in the African diaspora. I initially was going to do my dissertation on export processing zones in Jamaica.
Seriously?
Yes, seriously.
Okay. I'm sorry. I just have to interrupt. I'm like, that I did not see coming. It would have taken me a while to guess. Export function in Jamaica.
Exactly. So I don't know if you remember, the course I taught at Amherst College was like globalization in the African diaspora or something, global capitalism in the African diaspora. And there's actually a section of my dissertation that's about like Sir Arthur Lewis and Eric Williams and economic development and modernization theory. And a lot of my focus in that regard was a sort of discursive framework around that. So the convergence of like Enlightenment discourse and anti-Black racial oppression and how that comes to animate theories and ideas of development.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, so I still teach courses that are on like economic development. So I'll teach people like Walter Rodney, Clive Thomas, the Plantation School, Norman Girvin, et cetera, et cetera. So I am still very much interested in that. From a teaching perspective, I don't necessarily write about that, although my very first article was about Clive Thomas. And I did that with my dissertation advisor, Percy Hintzen. Another sort of area of inquiry is like the Black radical tradition broadly conceived. I've written a lot about Du Bois. I've co-written a book with Gerald Horne on Du Bois, and specifically his sort of kind of 1930s onward, as he took on more, in some ways, more of a leftist orientation, moving toward the Communist Party. I've written about Claudia Jones. And other, Black thinkers who are in or adjacent to the Communist Party. And then the third area that's linked to the second is the intersections of anti-Black racial oppression and anti-radicalism, specifically anti-communism.
Mm-hmm.
And there I'm interested in like how all three branches of government and different levels of the state, so, society, institutional, and then state actors understand Black people and radicals to be mutually constitutive threats to the state. And that's what my book, Black Scare, Red Scare, was about. And I find that Black studies is a good field for all of these modes of inquiry because for all of its faults or flaws, it takes seriously from the outset that the African diaspora and Black people and Black life are worthy of study. So it's not something that you actually have to defend. Now, how methodologies come to bear on that, like your approach to it, those are things that are sort of up for debate in the context of Black studies, but the fact that they ought to be studied is just taken as a given. And so that, I think, keeps my sort of fidelity to and allegiance to the field.
Yeah, I'm really interested in this series. It's a year-long series, but I'm really interested to see how people respond to these questions and engage these conversations who have what you were talking about, this not only a doctoral or postdoctoral interest in the field of Black studies, but actually all the way from the undergraduate through graduate school. My collaborator with this, Ashley Newby, is an undergrad and PhD in Black studies, and I just think that some of these names and some of these questions of methodology that you mentioned, they're just so much more acute the longer you stay in the field. Mm-hmm. But if you've been in that field since, the day you stepped on a college campus, I think that orients you a little bit differently. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, actually, initially I started out, I think I was a history and political science major. So I didn't declare my major in African American studies until I think my sophomore year, the end of my sophomore year and my early junior year. I was taking some Black studies classes, and most of the classes I took in politics were like Black politics classes or diaspora politics, mm-hmm. but I didn't declare my major until, so it wasn't the minute I stepped foot on campus, but it was pretty early on. And even when I was in, traditional majors, I was taking like the Black classes because those were the things that I found to be interesting. So, yeah.
Yeah, well, we'll think of step foot on campus as that moment you know what you're going to study.
Right.
We could figure it as that sort of thing. Well, this is a funny question for me to then ask you. And we worked together for a year at Amherst College, and we've had this conversation many times. So, but I'm curious, to hear you talk at some length about this, which is how you imagine the field of Black studies, because as you know, it has two tensions at its origin, right? The first really being this intensely political agitation, right? An uprising that's connected to both student communities on campus, but also surrounding communities and broader questions in the 60s and 70s around Black liberation struggle. But along with that is also the origin of the field as the desire to articulate, cultivate, and extend the Black intellectual tradition, literature, the arts, expressive culture, as well as social scientific inquiry. And so when you think about the field of Black studies, I'm curious how you think about the sort of twin origins of it, right? Of the movement towards an intellectual tradition in a broad sense, but also the deeply political meaning of Black liberation, community struggle that crosses both campus and city borders, but also international borders.
Yeah. So I think that from the outset, there were always, I think, different intellectual trajectories and traditions. You had at least like a cultural nationalist strand, like a Marxist strand, and even very early on, like a sort of feminist identitarian strand, what might I say. Like, this is from really the outset. Like, if you read books like Martha Biondi's Black Revolution on Campus, for example, and these aren't just sort of political orientations. I think they also have to do with people's intellectual investments as well. So to talk about like a Black intellectual tradition, I think is a little bit tricky. Just like to talk about a Black radical tradition is a little bit tricky. And so I think that different modes of thought were embedded not only in the struggle for Black studies, but also how Black studies should be codified over time. But I do think that the sort of bringing together gown in town, as they called it, right, was a really important thrust of Black studies, and something that is basically absent now. There's certain places I think that at least pay lip service to this. So like Virginia Commonwealth University, right, or places that have a community outreach or component or a class or something that they have students take. But by and large, it's become wholly institutionalized. But that contradiction was endemic in the project from the outset, because if you're trying to forge space in an institution, institutionalization is going to be the ultimate outcome. Period. Like, it doesn't even matter what the institution is. And what that actually means is that you take on the sort of identity and approach of the institution that you're trying to become a part of, but at the same time that you're actually changing the institution as well. So it's not like a one-way street. So I think that with the advent of Black studies, more interdisciplinarity permeated like the institution in general. There was more focus on issues of what we now call DEI. It was affirmative action at one point. It was self-determination, I think, at the point of the Black Studies movement. And so I think that those are, the effort to wrest space, to reclaim space, to democratize, and to redistribute resources and power was a really important incursion into academia. And I think that we see that thrust in cyclical ways. But at that time, the Black Studies movement was appended to a broader social movement. And we kind of saw that with Black Lives Matter to a certain degree, but not in the same way, because of different, horizontalist trends or decentralized trends or whatever. It didn't have the same strength and the same cross-pollination. And so I think that Black studies is much more disembedded from movement now, which made the institutionalization thrust more powerful. And so we have a lot more careerism, a lot more thought leadership approaches, we have a lot less commitment to a broader transformational project that I think was present from the outset to varying degrees. And so that being said, I do think Black studies still provides a space. I call it sometimes, pejoratively, like a refugee camp. It provides a space for persons who have experienced various sorts of neglect or abuse in their other disciplines. Are able to come to Black studies, and that's students and faculty alike, and have a particular type of community and experience. And I think that that's important. But then that can also impinge on the autonomous identity of Black studies, right? When all of these other ideas and approaches and commitments are coming to bear on Black studies as a space that's already constantly under attack.
Yeah, no, there's so much in that. What you were saying, this idea of a refugee camp is and both makes me laugh a little bit, but definitely a laugh to keep from crying, because I think that for both students and faculty alike, So this is very much people's experience, right? It's a difference between, what I like about that image. I mean, I'm sure some people would think it was problematic or whatever, but what I like about it is it really captures how it does go beyond just my work doesn't fit to how these are actually places where people's dignity and integrity are often compromised, attacked, right? And they live in a different space. But as you say, it changes something about the field or changes the trajectory of the field in ways that I think are worth talking about. And that's part of what I'm interested in, always coming back to the origins of the field and what that means for us today. Mm-hmm. Not that we're bound by the past, but it has levels of instruction, right? As you just put it so well, institutionalization comes at a price. And what do we think about that price having been institutionalized? Is there a way to sort of break that back out? Right.
Right. And it doesn't have to be that way, right? You can exist because departments are made up of people. And so we don't have to exist in a sort of genuflecting relationship to the university. That's a choice. That's a choice that these places make. And oftentimes, administrations will strategically place persons at the helm of a department or program so that it takes on a particular culture, but it doesn't have to be that way. I think there's a way to have a modicum of self-determination. Some people call it undercommons. We might call it marronage, whatever, right? People have different either metaphors or conceptions of what that might look like. But it also has to do with relationships. How do you relate to your colleagues? How do you relate to your students? How do you relate to the material? Whose ideas matter? And so I think that even those small ways that Black Studies departments and programs can be forged to be more collective, community-oriented, more responsive and engaged with movement, people don't even have the ethical commitment to that, right? It's become institutionalized even in its ethos. And I think that is something that can be shifted. And it does happen in a few Black Studies programs or departments, but it's by and large, there's a lot of rat beef. There's a lot of dissension in these spaces. I mean, it's not unique to Black Studies, but it's particularly terrible because given the origins and given what the project was supposed to be, right?
Yeah. And I think often it gets left up to individuals, like what individuals are forging these. I mean, it's a rancher libertarian profession. People do on their own, and sometimes they do wonderful things. But I always come back to that question of what is the collective, the department doing? Right. How do we orient and how do we think about ourselves? Well, let me ask you a question specifically about your own research. I'm curious when you've, as you already articulated, your work has a real historical and political theory or political science dimension to it, and I feel like both I learned a lot about the field of Black Studies, but also, as an institution or anti-institution, however we want to think about it, but also about the boundaries of the field of Black Studies. And I'm curious how you understand your writing, both the recent book, maybe the Du Bois book as well, how you see in your future work, how you see it both in relation to the history of the field, but also what boundaries you think it pushes. Right, so the history of the field, you see it embedded in sort of strands of scholarship, but also how do you see it sort of breaking out into new directions?
Well, I think that Black Studies really is or can be a side of knowledge production that's not beholden to traditional methodologies or canons in ways that other disciplines are. So, for example, in my book, I took a chunk of time, 1917 to 1954. If I was in a traditional history program, that would have been hugely problematic. And in fact, a lot of historians are like, how are you covering this huge swath of time? And, it
Yep.
doesn't follow along the lines of traditional period or, traditional historical periodizations. And so I think being in Black studies, like we're just not beholden to that. Which, you know, with respect to applying for jobs, for example, that can be a setback, right? Because you're not legible in the same ways, because you're not only having conversations with historians, you're having like intellectual conversations, and you're writing with a whole plethora of people across different disciplines. And so I think that that's another approach, right? Black studies scholars, I can't say tend to be, but ought to be more well-read because you're drawing from so many different fields and thinkers. So if you take somebody like Du Bois, he's objectively like an interdisciplinary scholar. He's been sometimes called a sociologist or a historian, but he does all kinds of stuff: political economy, literature, social theory, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that's why a lot of people hold him up as like a model for the approach to Black studies. And so I really think that that's something that is reflected in my work as well. I also use like sources that may or may not count, right? Or might merit further scrutiny in other disciplines. So like I like to use a lot of communist pamphlets, for example, because I think they're great little resources. And then other, people use all sorts of things to varying degrees for sources. But I do think Black studies at least it opens up the space to do that kind of work. But it's up to us to have integrity and do that rigorously.
Yeah.
And so sometimes the openness of Black studies can make people not rigorous. It can make the work not move any aspect of the field forward. And it can make the work uncritical. And then people can hide behind different types of identitarian categories or whatever to defend work that's actually not good. And that happens again in all different types of fields. But I think that in a field that's so open, one can be more prone to do that and not be trained well in particular methodologies and in particular sites of knowledge. And so it can get a little bit cacophonous.
Yeah. So maybe you've already answered this in some ways, but just to put it directly, one of the things that interests me about your own trajectory, as I said before, is undergraduate, graduate, and then a series of appointments in Black studies. And so I'm curious, to hear you maybe talk a little bit more about when you came back to yourself there in terms of your own work, how being in Black studies rather than, I know you were also spent some, little bits of time in political science, but not being in a discipline and being in an interdiscipline or multidiscipline or area study, however you want to characterize it, the field of Black studies, how that's impacted both your research, but also your teaching. Because as you said, I think there's something so important that's hard to communicate, that if you work in this interdiscipline space, you actually have to work extremely hard because you can't just pull up a poster and talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
You have to actually study, how do you talk about visual culture, right? How to deal with historical documents, how to deal with social movements and theorizing them and so forth. But it also impacts our classrooms. All of a sudden, we have to tutor students inside this exact kind of space. Mm-hmm. So I'm curious how you feel like your writing and teaching has been impacted by basically always being in this interdiscipline space.
Well, I'm a big ideas person. So like I'm an ideas man, as I say. And so that's not a lot of people. And I think that being a big ideas person is very amenable to Black studies, or Black studies is amenable to big ideas people, because I can draw in so many places and bring so many things together. And then having been, having different types of professors who are actually, I don't know that I've ever had a professor that had a PhD in Black studies. I could be incorrect about that, but most of them are trained in dominant disciplines, because just temporally, but also because of one of the bugs of our field, which is that we don't hire people with PhDs in Black Studies. But
Yeah.
but so you pull from all of that, right? So my dissertation advisor was a sociologist. I had, some historians that I've worked with, some ethnic studies folks. And so I think that part of how that shaped my writing is that, like, everything is up for grabs for me. Like, I don't have any real, like, limitations with respect to what I'm willing to draw on. But on the other side, I'm not really rooted in any particular methodology. So I kind of had to teach myself to, like, archival research, and I'm not that good at it because I'm not a historian. I'm just historically nosy, and so I get off track when I'm in the archives or just follow things, right? And so I'm not always as productive as I could be if I had a particular type of historical training. With discourse analysis, I just kind of look things up and figure out how to sort of mine the meaning in a particular text, but I'm not formally trained in it, and that can be a real setback, especially when people who are formally trained in those fields probably read my work. It's like, oh, well, this isn't real history. Well, it's not supposed to be, right? It's supposed to be Black studies. With respect to teaching, I think I've only taught Black studies courses that are cross-listed, so I don't have anything to check it against. But I really do like to build intellectual communities within my courses. And so I like to do a lot of reading in my courses, like round robin readings. Number one, because I feel like students don't be reading all the time. And so we at least have something to draw from, right? I think that it's dialogical. I like to do group work. I like to bring in, like, multimedia sources. I like to have people zoom into my course. And that's a function of I was the only person in Black studies at Carleton College. Like, I was the one person with an appointment in Africana studies at that time. And I'm like, this can't just be Burden-Stelly studies. We have to get voices from other Black studies scholars. So I'd often have people zoom in to my courses. And so it was important in that regard, but it's also just important to hear other people talk. And I also think I just think it's really cool to have students meet the people who wrote the book and be able to ask particular types of questions. And so, again, that sort of multifaceted approach to me feels like a function of coming out of Black studies, because it is, again, so open and multifaceted. I don't feel like I have to stand in front of a class and lecture for 50 minutes. That's just not a good way to learn the critical thinking and the deep, big questions that are the sort of guiding tools of a field like Black studies.
I mean, I don't know if you found this in your classes, but teaching in these kind of multiple registers, I do regularly have students, and by regularly, I mean all the time, ask me when it comes time to assignments, which is when they have their clarity, I think, about what's going on. We'll say some version of, what am I supposed to be saying in this class? How am I supposed to be writing in this class? And there's something really interesting about, for me, having previously, I mean, a long time ago now, taught in philosophy departments where there is a particular way that you should be processing the material, to say to students, well, this is where you have to find your own relationship to the material. Because I've shown you these multiple ways of looking at, this Zora Neale Hurston essay. We looked at a dance piece, right? We listened to some audio, right? We read a little bit of cultural theory, and then we had this other kind of discussion. And putting students in that space, I find, like, really interesting, precisely because they haven't experienced that kind of freedom, but also that kind of responsibility to material, right?
Mm-hmm. I've had to give them less freedom. I used to, like, for example, allow students to pick, like, what type of final project they wanted to do, like whether it was an essay or a podcast episode or some a group project or whatever. I find that students actually, just because of no matter how much we try to be Paulo Freire, right, and push back against the institutionalized forms of knowledge, it doesn't, if you're the only one doing that, it doesn't actually work. And so I think that I have more strictures. I give students just more scaffolding than I would before. But then if a student came up and said, well, I want to do it this way, I would allow them to do it, right? But I think that I've fallen back on like writing. Number one, because writing is actually really important, but I've fallen back on like more traditional assignments just because the open-ended thing, and it depends, right? You can kind of tell with the culture of a class. Every class is different, but by and large, I didn't find that allowing students to have more what I thought was autonomy and self-determination, right? Which is the essence of Black Studies. It went over like a lead balloon. They actually don't want that, right? They want to be able to talk shit, but they don't want to actually they don't want to have the responsibility of freedom, right? They want to have the option of it, but not the responsibility. And that's fine. They're young.
I do have to say, if one of my students was listening to this, they would be like, dude, that is a lie. You actually do just assign essays. And it's old fashioned, but like finding like the way you, what kind of citations you make, what kind of register you write in. But you're right, that responsibility is part of what is anxiety producing about Black studies. But cultivated or found in the right kind of place and the right kind of student and the right kind of moment is the whole world opens up, because the whole world is an archive, right?
Yeah,
as
I think it comes out in
point
discussion.
of evidence.
Like, I think that the flexibility and kind of creativity and like you can see the wheels spinning in the context of discussion, right? Where I think, or low stakes things that aren't graded or that are just a few points. I think students are a little bit more willing to take the risks. But when it comes to like something that's 25% of your grade, I don't think. It's just like that hasn't been my experience. Maybe at the Ivy Leagues it's different, but I doubt it.
No, I think we were both at Amherst College. Those students play it pretty conservative when it comes to getting their A.
Yep.
Let me ask you a big speculative question. We were talking beforehand and a little bit about this. Or you mentioned it. What do you think, looking at the history of Black Studies, what do you think Black Studies has done particularly well, and what do you think it has not done particularly well?
I think Black Studies has persisted well, despite the institutional pushback, despite lack of funding, despite, every 5 to 7 years, the special issues of journals like, is this the end of Black Studies? Despite, terrible enrollments and low majors at certain points. Of course, there's upshots like around 2020. You have, upsurges around in majors and in interest in the classes around things that are happening in the world. But then there's those real low points, especially as careerism takes over. Despite that, Black Studies has persisted and it's expanded. So I think we have more PhD programs than ever, right? I think that we have more programs moving toward departmentalization. So Black Studies has persisted. That's something, because there are things that don't exist anymore, right? There are whole fields that just don't exist anymore. The mistakes are legion. I don't. Sometimes I say that I'm post Black Studies. I actually don't know that. I don't actually know how we are other than being a sort of potpourri of different people who do Black shit. I don't actually know how Black Studies stands apart from other disciplines now. Right? Because it's not the political commitment. Because, for example, when I look at the encampments that just happened. So at Wayne State, our department did put out a letter in support, not of the encampment, but it was an incident that happened around trying to get the university to divest. But at a place like UCLA, for example, I was told that like the Black Studies faculty weren't the faculty that rallied around the encampments, right? And I don't know that that was the case at very many universities. I think at a place like Princeton, perhaps, the faculty rocked with the students, but it wasn't like across the board Black Studies that was standing up, which is something that, given our history, you would think that we would be at the forefront of that, right? So it's not that we're more politically active. That's not the case. Like, it's not that we're, producing students that are going on to do movement work. That's not always the case. Oftentimes our students are as interested in working at Goldman Sachs or some,
Yeah.
NGO or nonprofit as any other field. So I think other than taking Blackness and Black people as worthy of study, which is important, other than that, I don't know how Black studies is distinctive, and it's actually harder to get jobs because if you have a traditional a degree in a traditional discipline, you can get a job in Black studies easier than vice versa. I don't know how well students are trained coming out of Black studies PhD programs in ways that are legible to the dominant disciplines.
Mhm.
I don't know that. So there is perhaps more social awareness, but that might be correlation, not causation. It might just be that students who are more socially conscious are in Black studies. It's not that Black studies made them more socially conscious. The departments often have a lot of friction and this is not across the board, but oftentimes. So I don't know. I don't know. I just think that there's a lot of issues with Black Studies. We don't have a strong professional organization. So the National Council for Black Studies is ostensibly the professional organization of Black Studies, but it's so ideologically narrow that, and it is not always attended by a broad cross section of Black studies students. It tends to be very narrow cross section. So we don't have like a equivalent of like a APSA or a American Sociological Association or American Philosophical Association. We don't have that equivalent.
Mm-hmm.
So there's just a lot of issues. But we continue, which is a strength.
Persisting is not a small victory, but as you say, it comes with its own set of be charitable and say tensions, but certainly lost moments for success and engagement. So I think that was ambiguous enough, but you covered it. I think the question of Palestine liberation struggle in Black studies is one that will be hopefully talked about for a long time, because I think it's a kind of an anarchy of responses that we need to reckon with. And so, you've kind of led into this question that I have around the future of Black studies. And I want to put it in terms of how would we think about Black studies being a success as a field? I mean, it's this 50-something years, right? But looking forward, what is the sign of the success of Black studies? I would put it in two ways. Is the sign, or, ask it in two directions. One is the sign of success of Black studies that it would have had such an impact on disciplines, which it has, I think you can say, over the years, and sort of thinking well into the future, that would so impact disciplines that those disciplines would no longer need Black studies to basically pick up the slack for what those disciplines can't do. Like a philosophy department no longer be so absent of the study of the philosophical dimensions of Black life that it needs Black studies to pick that up, plug in any other department that way. So is the success of Black studies to, at some point in the future, to no longer be needed, to dissolve itself? Or is the success of Black studies to define itself along the lines of a discipline so that it becomes something that could never be absorbed into disciplines or redispersed into them? So I know it's a very speculative, future-looking question, but you kind of stumbled on it, not stumbled on it, but you sort of walked into this space of this question when you were saying, I think we don't have a real strong sense of who and what we are outside of our own institutional presence.
Yeah, I don't know that either of those would. To me, the success of Black studies would be a deep and enduring engagement with movement, and to have a cadre of scholars who do work that is alive in the real world and that matters to people. To have, departments or programs are actually engaged with not only surrounding communities, but also the international situation. So doing work that, regular people are actually reading and using in their study groups, and training students who actually have like a practical skills. Back in the day, the community development corporations, these were funded in various quote unquote inner cities, and part of that, like Ford funding and Melly, at that time it was mostly Ford funding, they would train just regular people in like social scientific skills. So how to do a survey, right? How to do research data. And so I think training students not only to have those skills, but also to apply those skills in ways that actually are about, how do we, document and preserve the legacies of movement organizations beyond like SNCC, right? Beyond the ones that we know about that are forming and happening all the time. If you're more historically oriented, how do you create sort of movement cultural products, movement art and movement literature and poetry? If that's how you're oriented, how do you do those types of surveys and participant observation of things that are happening in movement? And so to me, that is what would make like Black studies distinctive, and that's what would make it something that has longevity and that actually is transforming what it means, like both sort of the ethics, epistemology, and politics of the university, right? Like doing that type of work. And so whether or not Black studies is more like traditional disciplines, or whether or not Black studies puts itself into obsolescence because other disciplines have decided to do some of the Black shit, I don't know that those are the terms by which I would measure or engage success. But it's like, are we actually performing the function of the university, which is class reproduction, which is more alienation? Or are we doing work that is really to the end of transformation and liberation, and really forging connections that break down the real and imagined walls between academia and the world? So that to me would be what would make Black studies significant in the long run.
Yeah. Back to the question of the Palestine liberation encampments, I remember being on the University of Maryland campus, and a group of students were reading passages from Césaire's Discourse on Colonialism out loud to each other. Like it was a group of like 40 people. And it did make me ask a question that's very much in that spirit, which is, what will be our discourse on colonialism, which is a very specific kind of text. And, is that the best future of Black studies, to make sure that we produce these things? And are we? I like that way of thinking about it. I think it's a hard question to ask of ourselves, as we have our own curiosities, but that's part of what political obligation is. It doesn't always come down to our particular curiosities and personal passions, but a commitment to something bigger. Yeah.
Listen, if Du Bois can write horrible fiction and do, a study of of cotton in Lowndes County, and do Philadelphia Negro, we're not all Du Bois. Du Bois was one of one, but I think that we can do our own sort of individual pursuits, our pursuits of happiness, and do things that matter to people. Because what matters to people, a person is a person because of people, as they say. Like, what matters to people ultimately matters to us and our children, and, the world that we're trying to build. So, yeah.
So maybe that's already an answer to this last question I have, sort of wrap up question, which is, what do you think people in Black studies should be asking? Like, what is the question you think we should be asking today?
What is to be done? It's the question that Lennon asked. It's the question that we need to continue to ask. What is to be done, and what is my historical task? And who am I responsible to in that historical task?
Excellent. I love that as a place to end. Vladimir Burden-Stelly. There are a few better things to be than that. So really, Charisse, thank you so much for making time for this. This is absolutely fascinating. I love your work. I love the way you think about these things. And I learned a lot. I also have a lot to think about. I think it's going to be the case for anybody who listens to this. So really, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me again, and look forward to talking again soon.
All right. Take care.
Thanks.